This is Mark Sobel, U.S. Chair, OMFIF. At OMFIF, we focus a lot on monetary policy. But as monetary policy's impact diminishes around the effective lower bound, fiscal policy assumes added importance, and this is truer than ever amid the pandemic. Today, I'm honored and delighted to be joined for a discussion on U.S. fiscal policy by Maya McGinnis, President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Her areas of expertise include budget, tax, and economic policy. The committee is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization committed to educating the public on issues with significant fiscal policy impact, and the committee's reputation has grown considerably under Maya's direction. The committee also has a tremendous webpage, which is a true font of information on the nightmarish complexity of U.S. fiscal policy and its processes that I recommend to all listeners. Welcome, Maya.
Thank you.
So, thanks. Great to have you. So, I'd like to look at U.S. fiscal policy from the standpoint of where we stood before the crisis, where we stand now, and what we will need to do post-crisis. So let's start with where we stood before COVID to tee up the rest of the discussion. So what happened to the debt to GDP ratio before the global financial crisis and afterward, ahead of COVID? How would you assess the stance of U.S. fiscal policy in this period, and especially the last few years?
Okay, great question, great starting point, because we were, of course, before this surprising crisis, and we knew that the economy wouldn't expand forever and there'd be some kind of a downturn, but very few people obviously were predicting the crisis would be of this nature. Before the crisis, obviously, in the previous crisis, our debt had grown considerably. And what one would have expected and what we should have done was bring that debt back down to sustainable levels during the extended period of growth that we went through. Basically, the definition of an unsustainable debt is one that is growing faster than the economy. And unfortunately, we didn't do that for many reasons, both policy and I would suggest political. Through particularly the second half of the economic expansion following the 2008-2009 crisis, we took measures that made the debt markedly worse. We had multiple rounds of tax cuts, multiple rounds of spending increases. And as a result, Congress passed, some were bipartisan, the tax cuts were just Republicans, the spending increases were bipartisan, and there was another round of tax cuts that were bipartisan as well. But the president signed into law roughly $4 trillion in new borrowing during the period of economic expansion, at a time when you would have thought we would have actually put into place savings. So as a result, we entered this recession with the debt the highest it has ever been in this country, other than right after World War II, growing faster than the economy, with at the time interest payments the fastest growing part of the budget. That has improved because of low interest rates, but I'm sorry, interest payments were squeezing out other parts of the budget, and on a trajectory where the debt was going to grow not just from the near record levels it was already at, moderately fast, but actually reaching about 100% of GDP over a decade and breaking the records over time. So we entered this position in a very weak fiscal position. And of course, one of the main reasons you care about fiscal policy is to be prepared for emergencies. So it was politically reckless. It was policy-wise kind of setting the new norm of that you don't pay for anything. And I think it's laid the foundation to make fiscal policy fixes all the more difficult once we get through this crisis and once again have to turn to issues of concern and concerns about the national debt.
Thank you. And when you say 100%, you're referring to
debt held by the public.
Debt held by the public, which is the measure we use in the U.S. as opposed to general gross government debt, which many countries around the world tend to cite, and the IMF uses as well. So
that's right. For apples to apples comparison, it's more difficult because we net out our big trust funds, we net out our financial assets, but that's correct.
And state and local, we keep out of the debt held by the public figure.
Right.
COVID hit. We put our economy into a coma to try and sort out the health issues with the pandemic. The idea was then we could reopen and we would bridge the gap with fiscal spending. we may have a deficit around 16% of GDP this year. I assume you agreed with that overall strategy. Of course, unemployment remains high. There are going to be huge structural dislocations. I feel that we've flopped as a nation on the health front, so our rebound may be slow and prolonged, necessitating even more support perhaps. There's a debate now in DC about whether we need more fiscal support. There seems to be heated disagreements. The Republicans want a skinny bill. A month ago it was $1 trillion, now it's $500 billion. The Democrats had a $3 trillion bill, but they've indicated a willingness to come down to around $2 billion. There doesn't seem to be agreement about whether state and local government spending should be included in this, even though they're a major employer. So how do you feel about these issues? As I said, I assume you agree with the overall strategy, but do we need more support, and do you have a view on how much?
Right. So certainly one of the reasons you want to have a healthy fiscal situation is so that you can borrow and spend as needed during crises. So absolutely agree that we've needed to put a lot of money into the economy. I thought the debate about healthcare needs versus economic needs was a really important one to have. I think that's how we should think about things. One of the problems in my area of work is that people are unwilling to confront trade-offs. We like to sell everything as free lunches, and there are trade-offs. And it was a trade-off I think we strongly should have done. In fact, we probably should have put our economy in a deeper in a deeper coma for longer, and so we could have come out more quickly. That's at least what we were saying at the time and continue to believe. So yes, I think that putting the massive recovery, trillions of dollars into the economy that we have was important, and I think we're not done. This is the kind of time where you want to err on the side of too much. If anything, obviously you want to get it right, but rather have too much, along with the understanding that once you get through the economic downturn, you'll focus on bringing the debt back down. And it seems that both sides, neither side is very good at kind of encompassing those two thoughts at the same time. We need to do as much as we think is right now without constraint, and we need to agree that we will turn our attention to dealing and cleaning up that fiscal situation later when it's the time. When it comes to the actual measures, I think the 3 T's of stimulus are really important. You want it to be timely, temporary, and targeted. And in the first round, I think what we did incredibly well is it was timely. We got a lot of money into the economy really very quickly. And so far, we have a great tool for anybody who is interested in looking at where the money is going, through what agencies, through what authority, how it's being spent. Great tool to keep up with things, evaluate things, and ultimately kind of see what worked and what didn't. But so far, out of legislative spending, we've spent $2.2 trillion out of the $4 trillion that has been authorized. And out of money that's available through the Fed, we spent $2.3 trillion out of the $7 trillion that's been authorized. So we approved a lot of money very quickly. We're moving it to the economy more slowly, which in many cases is appropriate. Unemployment insurance, you don't pay all at once. You pay out over time. Tax cuts are paid out over time. So I think we did a really good job then, and I do think we need to do more. I also think that as we do more, this becomes a time where we focus more on the targeted. How do we really get those dollars into the economy in the smartest ways where they will be most useful? And I'm worried as this discussion kind of turns into more of the political back and forth that we lose the ability to be really smart on where we want things to be targeted. I would say you want to target things towards anything that is a potentially productive investment in health. Wasting some dollars in research looking for a vaccine is a good place if you're going to have to waste dollars overall. I think you want to target money to where there's real hardship. Giving money to people who are out of work is far greater priority than giving people money who are in work, right? So it's kind of simple targeting. And you want to create funding to keep businesses that are going to be able to make it through this, kind of keep them up and running with bridge type loans, but you don't want to throw a lot of money at businesses that aren't going to make it through this in the long haul. This is in many ways served as a massive speed up in disruptions that take place in the economy already. And so you can see a lot of changes that will and should happen in everything from telemedicine to telehealth, to the need for new businesses to pop up to replace the kinds of things, take cruise ships that will probably never return to where they were before. So you want to be strategic in where you're putting those dollars. The final thing I'd say is that the size of a bill is not random, though sometimes when you listen to the two parties talking about it, it feels like it's pulled out of thin air. I want 3 trillion, I want $500 billion. Seems like they're negotiating rather than thinking about what the size of what the economy actually needs is. So the way I think we should look at this is we should look at what the output gap is going to be in the economy. Right now, the estimate is that for a 6-month period, it will probably be about $750 billion. Then you need to figure out what the multipliers of various investments would be and actually put together a bill that is both targeted and the appropriate size, and that depends on how long time horizon you're looking for. Last point I would make, personal income actually grew from February to May. We have done such a good job of getting money into people's pockets. So even though market income shrank by 8 or 9%, personal income grew by about 6% during that time period. That is rather impressive. And as a result of that, that really helped keep the economy going and it helped alleviate a lot of hardships. But there are a lot of cliffs there as things are either petering out or coming to an end. And I will say that state and local certainly is an area we need to think about because there's so much employment tied to our state and local governments. And though we're at the beginning of the budget season, fiscal year is just starting for most state and local governments. We're at the beginning of that period. You're not going to see furloughs or layoffs now so much, but the planning process is about to make those hard decisions come true. And I think it would be foolish to lead to a higher unemployment situation because we decide not to put money to state and local governments. You can also tie those funds to alleviate some of the concerns. You can tie those funds to requiring reforms. States need to reform their unemployment insurance systems. If anything has been highlighted through this, it's that we are working through a truly anachronistic system in terms of how we get these dollars out. We need to update that. So tie money today to a plan to reform your unemployment system or your rainy day funds in the longer term. That would make a lot of sense.
That was great. Well, consistent with my opening salvo, let's turn to the post-COVID period. Hopefully when there's a vaccine or herd immunity is reached, and maybe we can differentiate between the nearer term post-COVID period and then the really the long haul. So as you mentioned earlier, you hope that when we get to some near-term semblance of normalcy, we should start gradually bringing back the debt GDP ratio down, though we'll still be struggling with dislocations. And then for the longer haul, I assume you're quite worried about the debt GDP trajectory for the United States and dealing with questions of entitlements and intergenerational equity and other issues. So could you tell us about the nearer term post-COVID period and then the longer haul? How should we deal with these challenges and spending cuts, tax hikes, both? Anything in particular you'd like to see?
Okay, so right, this is a 3-part phase, and I don't want to jump to the 3rd part, even though that's my area of expertise on the fiscal, right? We have to fight the virus, the pandemic. We have to get the economy back up and running, but we can't lose steam so that when it's time to turn to that important 3rd priority of getting our debt back under control, people don't do it. That's a really important piece that it's tied to all of them. In an ideal world, and we wrote a paper ahead of time recommending this, we would have had stimulus measures that came with long-term offsets. So if you want to give unemployment benefits like we were just talking about, in the long term, you'd reform those systems. If you want to give tax cuts today, in the long run, we think about what taxes you might increase or tax breaks you might phase out over time and have those ready to go kind of on the shelf so you don't have to figure them out in a crisis. Because as much as politicians act like the hard thing is putting together a stimulus package, putting together tax cuts and spending increases, that's the easy part for politicians. The hard part is offsetting those costs in the long term. And yes, this has massively increased the need for us to do that. And we had to do that before this crisis. We were, as I will say over and over, but on an unsustainable path. As you mentioned, one of those biggest challenges is our big spending programs on mandatory spending programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Social Security and Medicare both have trust funds that are dedicated to the programs that are set to become insolvent. And they have been, we've been aware of that for years and years, way precluding this crisis. And politicians, you can tell I'm frustrated with the polarization in our political system right now, because that's what stands in the way of doing so much of this. But they have kept Social Security in particular as a live issue and used it as a punching bag rather than fixing a system we have known for literally decades has made bigger promises than it has revenues to pay for. And therefore, we're jeopardizing the people who depend on the program. I think it's an unconscionable abdication of leadership. So we will need to now address many of those trust fund programs even sooner than we would have before, because the bottom falling out of the economy means fewer revenues going in, oftentimes more people on things like disability or using Medicaid. The Highway Trust Fund will likely run out of revenues next year. So we need to get on those trust funds, absolutely. And Social Security, not, I mean, I've been to more meetings than I can count where people say, oh, if we just put together a bunch of policy experts and took the politics out of this, we could fix this in a couple of hours. We know there are 5 levers to fix Social Security: the retirement age, the payroll tax, reducing benefits, changing the way we adjust for inflation and we index benefits, and possibly increasing some of the program's benefits for low-income people who have worked so they could be above the poverty level. 5 things. Like Social Security and like the overall debt, the problems are so big that on most of these, my recommendation would be, you're going to have to do them all. We have waited so long. There is no, I mean, these arguments of I'm not going to touch taxes or raise taxes are made up. They are not conceivably consistent with any of the priorities of the people who actually are making those claims. And likewise, on the other side, this notion that we can expand programs by trillions and trillions of dollars and only tax millionaires and billionaires to get there, it's not even close to reality. So the first step I'd like to see is I'd like to see politicians start telling the truth about this issue. There's a good idea out there, a fiscal state of the nation, where there would be a report that's provided to the country and an actual report shared with citizens so they'd understand the debt situation. Because once you look at the numbers and you start understanding that trade-offs and choices are what budgets are about, then we get really into thinking about those things. I certainly believe you have to look at this on both the spending side and the revenue side. There's a specific recommendation I like out there a lot. It's bipartisan, bicameral, developed by Senator Mitt Romney, called the Trust Act, where it takes each of these programs individually that have trust funds, and any program which is on an unsustainable path, its trust fund would have a small bipartisan commission that would make recommendations. I think commissions become more and more important because the political system's so dysfunctional. You kind of need to try to depoliticize the work and give recommendations that politicians can vote yay or nay and have kind of an arm's length, plausibility, deniability of that. Well, I would have done it better. I would have done it differently, but we do have to fix Social Security. So I really hope those things move quickly. Another suggestion is, as we gradually go from massive amounts of money into the economy to phasing that out, to kind of sitting tight, and then phasing in deficit and debt reduction, we should start by phasing in things that are going to go slowly. So raising the retirement age, right? People are living longer. We cannot afford benefits in huge chunks of people's lifetime, especially with the revenue base that we have. Asking people to work longer is something you want to phase in gradually. So you put that in place today, you make that announcement, it phases in very gradually. It doesn't do anything to destabilize a recovery, but it puts in place big improvements in systems down the road. Same with adopting chain CPI as the way we calculate inflation. That could make big improvements that would compound gradually. And then you start to move to the other parts of the budget. And I'm happy to go through how we could fix a budget, but we need to improve Social Security. Controlling healthcare costs is certainly the biggest challenge and remains probably the most important part of this. We focused a whole lot in healthcare coverage and quality, and as usual, kind of skip the hard part, which is thinking about how you control those costs. We still, even after so-called tax reform, which was really in large part tax cuts, we still have an over $1 trillion in tax breaks, meaning deductions, credits, exemptions, exclusions in our tax code every single year. We could generate a lot of savings from getting rid of some of those tax breaks. Marty Feldstein, great economist, and I, a number of years ago, wrote a plan where you would just cap tax expenditures as a level of income to limit how much you can claim, because 90% of these tax breaks are at the individual level, 10% are at the corporate level. To this day, I think that's a good way to depoliticize this. We're going to have to look at new forms of revenue, whether it's a carbon tax or a VAT. There's absolutely no way that the tax base is going to be able to support the level of spending that we have and the aging of the population, which is a huge factor in this. But the point I would make is definitely you don't want to start this today. We want to focus on the recession, but we want to start thinking about these things today. It's going to have to be bipartisan because both sides will need political cover. One great thing, which isn't going to happen, but it would be if we had a political campaign where at the very least the presidents, the future president, the people running for president talked about why this does matter and talked about that they would put out plans and what those might be so that people could stop hearing the lies of you can have it everything and instead start thinking through what are those trade-offs that I would like to make. Because if you sell somebody free lunch economics, they're going to take it. But in the end, tax cuts don't pay for themselves. We can't print money forever and think that that's going to be good for the economy. The same rules, despite big changes in our macro economy in terms of interest rates and inflation that have occurred, the same rules still apply, that you can't borrow your way into prosperity forever. That is kind of a game of musical chairs. And when the music stops, it's going to be incredibly painful. And we should be thinking about sound fiscal policy kind of as defense. So we're prepared for whether it's another recession or some kind of natural disaster, a terrorist attack, huge shifts in our economy as a result of technology. All of these things require us to be prepared with a strong balance sheet, and making that a national objective and then coming up with the compromises and details to get us there is one of the bigger challenges that we'll have for the next president.
Absolutely, and throw in aging and declining potential growth, and it compounds the problems, and you have a full-time job for decades to come.
But just to the point you made, that's right. Sort of promises of high growth just aren't consistent with the demographic situation that we face, the aging of the population, and the slower productivity that unfortunately we don't control as much as we wish we could. So we can't pretend that we're just going to grow our way out of this. We have to take into account those economic realities as well. Agreed.
Absolutely. So in discussing the outlook, interest rates have been, and they're going to remain low for a long time. The Fed has made that clear. Debt service costs will be low. So we used to have these notions about fiscal speed bumps. The Europeans use 60% general gross government debt for Maastricht. The IMF uses 70% for emerging markets. Of course, we have deep capital markets. We've got the reserve currency. We're going to be at about 100% this year. We're financing that with ease. We wouldn't have imagined that years ago, I would have guessed. I was looking at a CBO table a week ago, and it said, well, we're at 100% for 2020, but if you take into account financial assets held by the government and Fed holdings of treasuries, you get down to 65% of GDP. So I guess, and we've done this without inflation, and there's a huge output gap. So I'd be curious just to get your views about whether we are overly fixated on the nation's debt and debt levels that we've traditionally held as speed bumps, and do we need to rethink some of these previously held conventions and instincts on sustainability?
Well, we certainly need to recognize that interest rates are much, much lower than we would have anticipated they would be when deficits are this large. There are big changes that have happened in the economy, global economy, as a result of globalization, quantitative easing. The role of the Fed has changed dramatically, and still a lot of unknowns. So what I would say is we are entering a period of uncertainty that should make us highly, highly nervous about when things shift, because you cannot depend on, in some ways, artificially low interest rates forever. And it feels like the economy, which had gotten addicted to debt, my concern was that we were so used to borrowing for everything, we really didn't know how to break out of it. And our new addiction is low interest rates. And it is enabling in many ways because it masks the sides of the deficit. Therefore, you borrow more, when there are many smart people out there who recommend that we do that, but oftentimes it's tied to whose political agenda they're talking about. It's often less economic and more partisan. But the more we borrow, once those interest rates do go up, the more damaging it's going to be. We carry this huge debt load where we're so vulnerable that if interest rates even go up a small amount, it has a massive effect on our debt payments and can destabilize the economy. So I keep feeling, okay, I'm a really, really bad skier. And this happens to me all too often, where if you're skiing down the mountain, you know you're out of control. You kind of know you're going to have to take the hit and fall over, roll off the mountain, but you're scared to, and so you keep going, but you keep going faster. That's how this economy feels to me. Like, we are in uncertain territory. Things are not good. We know we're going to have to make some hard choices, but I'd rather wait a few more seconds and in the political world, let the next guy take that hit. So probably most of your listeners are much better skiers than I am. I actually skied over my own thumb recently, which is quite a feat. And I just don't ski anymore. But it just does feel to me like we are hurtling towards a hard landing, and we don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know whether it's a shift in interest rates. We don't know whether it's changes in inflation. We don't know whether it plays out in our currency. But the goal should be not to manipulate the economy or bet on the weakness of other countries, because this is a relative game, and this is certainly something where we continue to look better than many of our economic partners or competitors, but that's not good enough. You don't want an annual report that says I'm better than that guy. You want an annual report that says here are our strengths, and not being able to point to the strong fundamentals of the US economy the way we used to be able to. That to me is huge cause for concern that those changes are enacted. Also, I'd say, so we all of us in this field follow the important work of Olivier Blanchard that kind of changed this discussion, where he talked about how when growth is higher than interest rates, it becomes far less of a problem. And that is true, but I'd point out a couple things. That's true when you're running basically balanced or small primary deficits. We are running very large deficits, which means we're already in a trajectory where that relationship will change between growth and interest rates. And second, the more you take advantage of that relationship, the more you say, okay, we can therefore borrow more, the less likely it is to persist that your growth will be higher than your interest rates. And so again, it is over and over for me a story of, why are we making ourselves more vulnerable? Basically for political ease. It's not because what we're doing is borrowing money, and I'm taking this crisis aside, because we should be borrowing right now in as smart and targeted a way as possible. But in general, it's not that we're borrowing for massively desirable public investments that will have huge returns. For the most part, we borrow to finance our own consumption. And you have to look at where a country is spending their money. And we are very consumption heavy. We spend $6 per senior on every one we invest in children under 18 at the federal level. Our interest payments on the national debt are more than the federal government spends on education. This is not a forward-looking, investment-driven budget. So even though most investments are actually better for the economy if they are paid for over time, even if that were the justification, that's not why this country is borrowing. This is purely a play of, I don't want to have to pay for something, which makes it more difficult to do so. We've created the norms where paying for something is no longer a given or the norm, and that makes it harder to start to ask that we do. So I think it's a dangerous cycle of blowing up the sense that if something is worth doing, it's worth paying for. And we need to figure out how we get back to that in the appropriate periods in the business cycle.
Well, thank you for that. You were referring to a relative game, and that we might look better. In the foreign exchange markets, they talk about less ugly, not looking better.
Or the best looking horse, the best looking horse in the glue factory is always my favorite.
I'm glad you mentioned Olivier and the R minus G question. Maybe this is a bit afield, but there is this notion of fiscal dominance in the literature and financial repression. As you know, to finance World War II, between World War II and 1951, the Fed just bought up Treasury paper, and there was a accord to stop that in 51. Do you worry about fiscal dominance, and even though this gets more into the realm of monetary policy, do you worry about fiscal dominance having implications for the independence of the Federal Reserve?
I worry about that tremendously. I worry about that because if you don't have kind of the healthy partnership between monetary policy and fiscal policy, the pressure mounts. Back to my careening down the mountain feeling, the pressure continues to grow on the Fed to become more engaged in fiscal policy. And we are in a critical moment in this country where our independent institutions are under an awful lot of pressure and in many cases assault.
Yeah.
And I am a huge believer in the importance for any country of those independent institutions. My favorite institution in the world is the one you just mentioned earlier, the Congressional Budget Office. It's actually what changed my career. I was working in finance and I read a report by the Congressional Budget Office and I just felt like, this is something that is numbers based and explains the policy and isn't pushing an agenda. And I'm a political independent, which is part of why I feel so lost in this highly polarized moment. But it was just great to get to learn something from reading about it and the importance of keeping institutions which are able to act in the best interest. And I would say, and Fed acts, CBO puts out information. They're different in that way. But I would say the long-term interest, because I think one of the biggest problems in all of this is that the long-term interest of the country is being sacrificed for the immediate interest. And I think giving the Fed the freedom and the political isolation to make decisions that may be hard, but are the best for the long-term well-being of the economy is critical. And yes, I think as these become more integrated, that's going to be difficult. Now, I'm not faulting any decisions that have been made thus far, because I think that a lot of smart decisions have kept this crisis and the previous crisis from being a lot worse than they otherwise would have been. But it's very difficult to figure out when you rip off that Band-Aid, and the more political pressure there is, the more risky it is that we won't in time. And so I think you can't look at this unknown territory without being concerned about where it will lead us.
Oh, great. Well, I'm going to have two more questions for you, and the audience will turn to audience questions, which can be submitted via the chat function. Okay, so we're discussing fiscal policy from a stabilization standpoint, by and large, so far, but it's an important distributive and allocative tool as well. I think you and I have agreed we can't necessarily agree on what we want to pay for spending. So we have Republicans that say no new taxes, and Democrats say only tax the rich. And basically what happens is the spending goes up and the deficit goes up, as best I can see. So does your committee have a view on the appropriate size of government as a share of GDP? Do you have a view on the inequality debate as relates to fiscal policy or progressivity in our tax system? And I think you answered a question I was going to ask, which is, but you can correct me, is we're not going to get the debt to GDP ratio down if we just raise revenue from the middle class, from the rich.
Yeah.
Maybe you could tackle all of those.
Sure thing. So we do not have a view on the size of government. And a lot of times people think that fiscal responsibility is somehow tied to believing in smaller government. And that's not the case. In fact, we're building a really cool tool that's going to allow people to figure out where they stand on their preferences on these things. But you can be a fiscally responsible big government person. It just means you pay for your new spending. And our board of directors, and very importantly, our organization, is bipartisan. So we have people who, and our board are really important people in the budget committee, but people who've run the Treasury Department, the Fed, the budget committees, CBO, OMB. So they all have experience in this. And there are people who have a strong preference for a larger government. There are people who have a strong preference for a smaller government, and there are many in between. So absolutely no position on that. What our main position is that borrowing should be used for economic reasons, not political reasons. When it comes to income inequality, I think the high levels of income inequality and wealth inequality are now posing a significant threat to our overall economic system. And so we don't have institutional positions, but I certainly have positions and have for a long time thought that income inequality is one of the biggest problems facing the country. And I think it's become much worse through the past crises. So whether you want bigger government or smaller government, and we look at government sort of where it's been historically, and where it's headed, we are headed to levels where the government will be much, much higher than it has been historically in this country. But there's a real reason for that. It's the aging of the population. My preference would have been that we got control of those mandatory spending programs sooner and earlier. And I think we should do it through means testing in many ways, where people who don't need benefits don't get them, or certainly don't get the larger benefits that they get today, right? People who've paid in more actually get more money out of Social Security despite needing it less. So I would change that, make it more of an insurance system, and make the revenue system more progressive as well, and use more of that money to both get control of our fiscal situation and make more investments, particularly in kids and long-term and human capital, I think, where we're very weak. But I do think income inequality threatens all of these issues, because if you look at this moment, this polarized moment in this country and the world, but let's just take our country, we have a project called Fix Us that looks at how we got here. And the reasons are political and cultural and institutional and loss of trust in elites, and they're also economic. And we're not going to be able to fix a lot of these problems unless people return to a sense of belief that our political systems and our economic systems are fair. And we've lost that sense. And I concur with the feeling that they aren't right now. I think capitalism is critically important for the incentives and use of markets that it provides, but I think we need to look at where it's failing and update those pieces of it. So that's obviously a strong opinion of mine, that income inequality needs to be addressed in all of this, and it can be. One of the things I'm always shocked about, though, is that people think fiscal responsibility and a preference for more addressing income inequality aren't consistent. They absolutely are. We need to think about reducing spending where we don't need it. Again, I would make it more targeted. There's a strong preference for universal benefits these days. Please, let's not put our resources into paying for college for families that don't need that. Let's put those resources somewhere else. And then when it comes to revenue, I think we can have a smart progressive tax code, but I also think we have to stop pretending that all the things that people want can be paid for purely from the super rich. We have to be both realistic and then look at our priorities. But I love the question, because I think budgeting, as much as I love Excel, budgeting is not a dry Excel exercise. Budgeting is about what the national priorities are. And I think there's some really interesting ways we could start engaging citizens, not in what should the monetary policy do, like that's not what we should decide, or even the specifics of healthcare cost control, but we can really start engaging citizens and crowdsourcing more than we do in this country. What things would you like government to solve? Where are there some shared objectives? And try to think about how we can make our budget a reflection of our national priorities. If you look at it right now, again, just to return to that, I think kind of startling statistic that we spend $6 on senior for every $1 we spend on children under 18. That is not a forward or future looking budget. And I think we should be thinking about and engaging people more in the question of where are our real national priorities and how should we spend and pay for the resources to achieve them.
Well, great. Well, let me just ask you a last question for this long opening round. There's going to be a little event in the United States on November 3rd. So do you, how would you characterize the fiscal plans of the contenders? And I did see an interesting piece on your webpage analyzing Mr. Biden's tax plans. I recommend it to all the listeners. And so when I was in the IMF, there was a little phrase which I think you would love based upon what you've said today. It goes to arithmetic, and it's, do the numbers add up?
So we actually run a project. One of my favorite projects that the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget does every 4 years is called US Budget Watch. And we look at all the major candidates' proposals. We provide fact checks when myths are being told. That's happening an awful lot in this campaign. We provide explainers so people can understand what's in different proposals. And probably most importantly, we provide a basic audit of the major candidates and how their proposals would affect the national debt. Now, it's not done, so I don't have the answers right now, but we will. So I encourage people to come back over the coming weeks, or anybody can sign up for our mailing list, and we will send you the overall scorecard of how both President Trump and Vice President Biden's proposals would affect the national debt. It is absolutely a policy that is missing in action right now, how people would address the debt. And again, I don't expect anybody to say this is what we should start doing right away, because we shouldn't. But we can't not be prepared for the fact that we have already added trillions of dollars to our debt, that we are hitting debt as a share of GDP at 100% next year, and eclipsing our national record in this country in not too many more years to come. That they need to start talking about their plans. There are more details out of the Biden camp on the new spending proposals that they recommend. They're not nearly as large as some of these huge programs we were hearing about during the primary, but they are quite expensive. And though the campaign has been very explicit with us that they want to pay for everything that they are spending, they have yet to put out enough plans, policies, offsets that would cover the cost of the spending they're recommending. So we will see how that comes out. The Trump proposal is really hard to know what to make of it, because it's recently they released 50 very, very, very vague policy points. It's by far the least specific policies we've ever seen during a campaign. What we do know is that last time President Trump ran, he had the most expensive in terms of national debt proposals we'd ever scored. They were massive. And so far, he's come pretty close to meeting those promises that he's, by signing into law through this new 10-year period, $3.9 trillion in borrowing during an economic expansion. It was interesting because during the campaign, when we scored his proposals, we said, these numbers are huge. They were even larger than the 3.9, but they couldn't possibly happen. And so I will eat my words. I was wrong. They actually did. The borrowing far, far, far exceeded what we ever thought would be plausible in the past 4 years. And so, and this was all with the president who also said he was going to pay down the debt in 4 years. So we don't know any more details that will come out of the Trump campaign, but it seems likely that deficit reduction was nowhere on the agenda for the past 4 years. It seems unlikely, though there's some rumors that it might start to be a priority, but it seems unlikely that we'll see much of it in the next 4 years. But we will do our best to score all the promises and actually put numbers on the policy and see where it leads us. I guess the final thing is, good fiscal policy doesn't make good politics unless you have a real leader who makes it. Unless you have a leader who is, I think, willing to inspire the country to focus on the long term, to focus beyond just party agenda, but recognize we're going to have to compromise on a bunch of things, and to be honest with the country, even when it's hard. That's the kind of leadership that is going to be required to help deal with the fiscal challenges that we have right now. And I think it's critically important at this time for this issue and for so many others as well.
Thank you for that. Again, I encourage audience to submit questions. One question, two-parter. Oh, you've partly tackled. It's about the output gap and addressing that. Gets one heavily into the debate about stimulus from the Treasury and the Fed. And I guess this gets into the whole issue of fiscal monetary coordination as well, which is being often discussed. And is this going to be a new normal, and could this create huge moral hazard? The second part of the question is probably somewhat farther afield for you, but it was about trade war, tariffs. I guess tariffs have fiscal implications, but are they effective, and are the economic costs worth it?
Great question. So yes and yes, I think this is going to become the new normal, and I am worried about it. And I think it will, because there's so many big challenges that we have right now that is going to be unavoidable for a little while, and then it's going to be too difficult to pull out of. And until we deal with the problem of polarization, we won't be able to fix any of these issues. So again, no criticism of the Fed's specific policies. I think the Fed has alleviated a ton of hardship and economic damage that otherwise would have occurred, but true concerns about how we sort of disengage from a path that will ultimately create a whole lot of risks that I think all of us who look at how the Fed is engaging with the economy are worried about for down the road. On trade, it's a great point. Tariffs are actually one of the unexpected areas where revenue have grown, and our deficit, which is going to be about over $3 trillion this year, is actually lower in real amounts because of tariff money that has come in. Here's what I'll say about this issue. I think the trade issues are real, and I think they should have been addressed. I think that on the macro level, all the aspects of trade in the short run, because not necessarily in the long run, but have certainly grown our economy by a significant amount every year. But I think the distributional consequences, and by that I mean in terms of income groups, geographical, and by industry, I think the distributional effects of it, which we didn't take enough measures to deal with, have led to a lot of the political dissatisfaction that we're facing now. And so I think this is a readjustment we have to go through, and there's no ideal way to do it. I think the second issue, of course, is the one of supply chains and resilience, that there is now much greater concern about being dependent on countries, particularly those which you are not aligned. I think we are in a dangerous position for having let ourselves get that far into a dependent situation. And the real problem here is that fixing that, or there's dependence, independence, and interdependence. And we want to, through our economy, think about where those different factors should be our objective. But I think resetting the economy, it's going to shrink our GDP. It's going to mean lower growth from what it otherwise would have been. And that's going to come really hard at a time when we're doing everything to get growth back up. But again, it's a short run, long run issue. We have to fix some of our trade dynamics, and in particular, our dependencies on both our dependencies and our giving away our role in certain markets. And obviously, I mean, I'm talking about China here more than anything else. I think it's a clear tension that we need to address, and I am a pretty strong believer that we need to address it aggressively. And the problem is it's going to cause slower economic growth at a time that we can ill afford it. But once again, if we delay, it's only going to get harder to fix that situation.
Well, I have lots of questions. I mean, one question I had was about the role of automatic stabilizers in the U.S. economy in comparison with Europe. I remember in the 2000 the global financial crisis, the U.S. was pushing for large-scale discretionary stimulus. Mr. Summers, the White House, and I recall the Europeans saying, no, we don't need anywhere near as much as you do because we have much bigger automatic stabilizers, and so you need to rely more on discretionary stimulus to get to where we are. And so I've seen recently some articles about whether we need a better system of automatic stabilizers to kick in without and avoid some of the political debates that we've had. How do you feel about that?
So first and foremost, what we need is a better system of governance. We need a system where politicians aren't so busy fighting against each other as members of parties that they put making policy to the side. We need a system where we are able to reward people for hard decisions that are in the better interest of the country in the long term. And we need to quit rewarding our politicians for, voting for the people who give us everything that seems good, like the sugar rushes of tax cuts and spending highs, and punishing those who tell you the truth about Social Security needs to be reformed. We're going to have to raise taxes. That's what we should be rewarding. That's why we have a project where we're working on that for the long term. However, it's not going to happen anytime soon. And in that realistic frame, I think automatic stabilizers have a hugely important role in the US economy, in that they take some of the decision making out of the political process and make them more tied to economic metrics. And so I think there's a good, strong argument we need to do that. Where I differ from some of the popular push on this right now is, I think it needs to be three-sided. I think you first need a set of metrics for when you would put more money into the economy. If unemployment hits a certain level, if GDP shrinks by a certain amount, maybe it even gets to targeting different things in different regions of the economy. Our regional differences are making huge, huge differences that we need to acknowledge in this, that our political system, the way it's structured, isn't very good at doing. So we need triggers, automatic stabilizers and triggers for when we would turn fiscal stimulus on. We also need it for when we would turn it off, because back to those 3 T's, you think you should craft stimulus that is temporary, but just look at what the president's been talking about. Oh, I want to have an executive order that would have a temporary payroll tax cut, which I actually want to make permanent, right? Like, he's not even whispering that part. We know he wants to make it permanent. So lots of times people will put policies in place that are temporary that they fully intend to extend. Same is true with the tax cuts that exist right now, which are going to phase out, but their supporters have every intention of making them permanent. So you want, second, a set of triggers that would turn stimulus off. When unemployment hits this, you'd start to turn off unemployment, extended unemployment benefits. When spending hits this, you'd phase out any rebates that you have, all sorts of triggers there. But the third and most important set, if you're going to do these two, is also when you'll turn fiscal consolidation on. Because we know where this is headed. There is going to be no moment where politicians in good faith say, the economy is strong enough, the debt is so high that to avoid us getting into a really bad situation, we are going to have to raise some taxes, reduce some spending, reform our big entitlement programs. That's what they should say, but nobody is holding their breath thinking that they will hear that in any of the coming years. And so you want triggers that would also help us know when to phase in fiscal consolidation. So a set of 3 triggers. It's a depressing process to have to put in place, because you're basically saying democracy is not working so well, so we're going to outsource some of the tough decision making, but it's realistic, and I think it would do us a lot of good to have those in place. And I think politicians would probably appreciate it, because so many of them, I am very, very critical of our governance system and our party system, but so many of our politicians really are good people who want to do the right thing and are working in a system that makes that incredibly difficult. So I think trying to reform the system in a way that makes it easier for them to do what they know is good for the country would be beneficial and appreciated.
On a more microcosmic level, one reform, so when I was at Treasury, we would spend inordinate amounts of time dealing with the debt ceiling. And even in international affairs, I oversaw the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which had a pile of dollars.
Yeah.
So,
sorry for stealing your
there
money.
were all these extraordinary measures that you would go through, and how you would go through them, and what that would imply for the debt and our holdings. Anyway, and it was incredible to me that the amount of time that the staff had to spend and the secretary all to engage in this political dance so that we could do what we know we were going to do, which is we're not going to default. And it took months. Anyway, I take it your organization would happily call for ending the debt ceiling.
It's a little bit more nuanced than that. First, those negotiations were just outrageous, because it's always been such political posturing. And to put the country in a situation where you start talking about these really reckless things that, again, normal citizens don't really understand. Half people don't understand the difference between a default and a government shutdown, and they are very, very different. And by half, I meant of politicians. So Yes, the debt ceiling has outlived its usefulness, and it's at this point far more dangerous than it is helpful. But it's actually the only fiscal constraint that exists right now. We usually don't even put a budget in place, and yet the government goes on. That's something that should be changed. When you pass a budget, there's literally no limit to how much you borrow for it. There's no fiscal targets, there's no fiscal restraints. So I am worried about tossing out the debt ceiling without replacing it with something. So two thoughts. One, I think anybody who is voting for legislation to increase the debt should be required to also vote to increase the debt ceiling. Therefore, people can't go home and say, I brought you these huge tax cuts. I brought you this great new spending program, and I really care about the national debt, so I voted against raising the debt ceiling, which a lot of politicians do. That is not the kind of cognitive dissonance that the political process should allow. So I think you move it and require that vote to precede the actual policy that would increase the debt. Second, I think there's broader reforms that we should look at. We recommended this literally 14 years ago now, I think, the Peterson-Pugh Commission, but we should put in place actual debt targets. So the debt to GDP, instead of going up on a path like this, we would gradually bring it down. You put in those debt targets, and every year your budget will be required to put forth a budget that is on track to meet those targets. You can pair it with triggers, so if it doesn't happen or you don't put forth a budget, automatic changes will be made. But you need a fiscal goal. And once we have that kind of a plan, you can get rid of the debt ceiling. That is by far a second best constraint, but we shouldn't get rid of it and have nothing to replace it with, because we all know that there is much more political pressure towards borrowing than being responsible. So you don't want to take the very few constraint mechanisms that still exist out of the process, which is already kind of in shambles as it is.
Fantastic. We always thought it was interesting because the government was being blamed for being reckless when it was just paying the bills that the Congress appropriated. But
it's kind of a remarkable shift of responsibility. It's like, I'm going to run up your credit card. You know, a robber steals your credit card, runs it up, and then yells at you for not paying the bills. It really is just like, if you can distance yourself from the hard part of something, it's a terrible system. So what Treasury went through, thank you for helping on it. It was terrible. I used to come in for some of those negotiations, and the Treasury Secretary would just say, like, what do you do? You're not supposed to negotiate with hostage takers, when people were talking about not raising the debt ceiling. And it just left Treasury in this terrible situation of having to do this juggling of trust funds, which nobody wants to do and isn't the way we should operate the country. So thanks for helping on that. Sorry.
Well, you've spent the whole hour telling us how we shouldn't be operating as a country. We have a lot of work to do. I really want to thank you for joining us today and for offering us so many fascinating, fantastic insights. Great overview on what a mess our fiscal situation is in the United States and how much homework we had to do for the coming decades. So thank you very much for joining us, Maya McGinnis.
Mark, nice to talk with you.